Some of the contracts have inflation accommodating clauses, and I think the discussions are going on around should we include it and how would it work. Contractors want it to be in and clients are nervous, understandably.
Welcome to the WTW podcast, Construction Blueprints, where we discuss the latest risk management and insurance trends, as well as issues facing the construction industry. We'll speak with a variety of construction leaders and experts on global topics who can help provide you a blueprint for building your industry knowledge.
Hello, and welcome to our WTW Construction Blueprint podcast. I'm Philippa Pearce, and I'll be your podcast host today. And I'm delighted to be joined by Kieran Dineen.
Thanks, Philippa. So I'm a civil engineer. I'm a fellow of the Institution of Civil Engineers. I spent my entire career in the construction industry. I've worked for across the sectors, client, consultant and contractors, mainly, I guess, on infrastructure, energy and ground engineering projects. What do I do now? I'm an independent consultant that I provide project support, whether it's technical support, contractual support, or commercial support across sort of challenges on live projects.
Well, thank you for joining us today, Kieran. And I'd love for you to share your thoughts on the impact of inflation on construction contracts and disputes.
UK inflation is about 8 to 10%, depending, and lots of measures, the retail or consumer price index, your sort of basket of materials and products and what they cost last year. Construction has been quite different and it's much more volatile. So, we've seen some really big figure increases. Ready mix concrete as nearly 20% rather than the 8 to 10. Steel prices have been very volatile and currently running through 12 months to February 21. We're running at about a 40% inflation increase. And generally, construction prices are north of 11% for materials and so on. That so obviously has a much, much bigger effect and harder to account for. And I feel also I see in the industry that there is, to a greater or lesser extent, we've become used to low inflation to the extent we don't really consider it. What are we seeing? We're seeing that obviously prices are increasing. And with our construction projects, which tend to be large value and relatively long duration, that inflationary impact is eroding profitability right from the very beginning, from when the contractor submits and has their proposal and their tender for the project accepted. Inflation is slowly but insidiously sort of stripping away the profitability. And that's going on for a long, long time. And also then for the client side, the cost of money, the cost of financing projects. So their costs are increasing in financing, which kind of leads to a sort of perceived reduction in value for money, an erosion of the value for money they might be achieving. And for the contractor, obviously, their prices are increasing, but also cash flow. Contracting is often as much about balancing the cash flow through the project, the cost that you're paying out for labour and plant and materials and construction, and there's a delay to the payment flowing back in through the construction contract. And somehow we have to fund that gap. And that cash flow cost is rising because of borrowing money as well. So the inflation sort of metric is having a really significant impact on construction, partly because the values are high and the projects are long, but also because the inflation in construction indices is much more volatile and higher.
What has the impact of inflation been on pricing?
Many of our contracts, I suppose, they have mechanisms for dealing with inflation, but sometimes because we've been in this kind of relatively stable, low inflation environment, we haven't really paid a lot of attention to them. Let's just think about how we price our projects, and effectively 3 big building blocks. First is fixed price lump sum approach to pricing. This works particularly well where the scope is well known and we don't expect much change. So the projects are then priced on a number of discrete activities. The contractors set a fixed price against each of the activities to deliver the whole project. And the contractor gets paid when they complete each of those activities. And as a consequence, because the price is fixed, they tend to carry most of the construction and the price risk, changes in price on labour, plant, materials, and so on. Secondly, perhaps where the client is fairly confident of what they want, but we do expect change, we might have the contract where it's remeasurable. So here the contractor would price a rate, unit rate for each activity. For example, supply and install the foundations. We might say, I will do that for you, Philippa, for £200 for every cubic metre of foundation I provide. And what we will do then is we'll remeasure how many cubic metres of foundations were required to deliver the foundation to your storage facility. And if the quantity necessary went up, I would get paid more. And if the quantity necessary went down, I might get paid less. And the foundation is a good example because the ground conditions are often uncertain. So we're going to provide the necessary foundations and we'll remeasure the quantity. So as a contractor, I'm still taking on much of the risk in terms of time and labour and materials, but not the risk of quantity. But I am taking the risk of inflation because inflation would affect all the other component parts. And probably the third big building block, which is particularly popular on large public procurement projects, something we call target cost. So now what we're asking our contractors to do is open your books and we will pay open book actual costs, the actual physical costs you incur in delivering our project. And on top of that, we'll pay a pre-agreed fee, a percentage fee to reimburse you for your overheads and profit along the way. So in that respect, the contractor wouldn't be taking on the inflationary risk because if the prices change, they recover their actual prices. If material costs go up, they recover a higher cost because it's a real cost. And if the quantities vary and there's more required, well, they get paid more because they get paid their actual cost. So to put a cap on it, we call it a target cost because prior to starting the work, the contractor and the client negotiate and agree an ambition, target outturn costs for the project. And the contractor goes away and says, if I can deliver your target cost project and I can come in under the target cost, we have a mechanism to share the cost saving. So if I bring efficiency and innovation and manage to deliver your project quicker and incur less cost and come in under the target, you and I will share the cost saving. So much more profitable for the contractor and encourage them to be efficient and innovative. However, if I am less efficient and innovative and perhaps, logistically I'm not as well organized and the costs overrun the target, the client doesn't pay all the cost overrun. And that cost overrun is shared with the contractor. So there is some financial pain. And the ambition of target cost is open your books and show me the real costs. Share and try and work together and be innovative, and we will share any cost savings. And if the cost overrun, we'll only part pay the cost overrun. So the contractor will suffer some financial impact. Now, if inflation is affecting the prices of everything, the contractor's costs are rising, but the target doesn't change. So as inflation impacts the project cost, the margin between the contractor's cost and the target is being eroded. So they're moving ever closer to and maybe exceeding the target. So inflation is increasing the contractor's risk of overrunning the target. So they're the kind of three big building blocks of how we might price things. And then if we look inside them and say, what about inflation inside the contract? Are there mechanisms for dealing with it? Yes, there are. Not every contract. Many contracts don't have it at all. And they say, please fix your price and that's it. You allow for whatever effective inflation, forecast. And what do we know about forecasting? All we know is we're going to get it wrong. But some do. Our building contracts, for example, JCT building contracts, probably in UK construction, the most widely used construction contract. They have some Well, they have three price fluctuation options, A, B, C. A is commonly used, and that allows the prices of any taxes and levies and contributions to be recovered, any change. So if VAT changed, you could recover the extent of VAT or national insurance contributions or taxes on materials or fuel duty. So where there are changes in taxes and legislative contributions, that would be option A, so we can recover that. And that's typically in most building contracts. And then options B and C traditionally have just been excluded. B would allow you to recover the effects of price fluctuation on plant, labour and materials, which is where the inflation is going to impact us. But generally, that's been excluded. And generally, we haven't been so troubled because inflation has been so low. And option C is again for price fluctuation, but using indices of price change. So the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors produce construction cost indexes. So using formulas to calculate the change in price rather than using actual change in price. And generally B and C have been excluded, and in the negotiation, people haven't been too troubled because inflation's low. What we're seeing now is much stronger conversations around contractors wanting to include that inflationary clause for plant and materials, and obviously clients being nervous about including it because they're opening themselves to the impacts of inflation, which are, we're forecasting, which are quite big. So that's JCT. And our NEC contracts, which are probably beginning to dominate in the bigger and certainly publicly procured projects, NEC contracts, they have an optional clause for the effects of inflation, and it's a simple framework. So they've written the content of the clause about how inflation review would work, and it's for the drafter to say, this is the index we're using, and we'll apply it to all of your costs every month. So rather than breaking it down into a fine detail, we can have a single index, or you can make it complicated and say we'll have a number of different measurement indexes, and NEC provides the framework of how that would use. And what about FIDIC, which is our most widely used international contract? How does that address inflation? And FIDIC, like many of the others, has a variety of different approaches, whether you want traditional construction contract, client employer designed, a design and build contracts, turnkey projects, engineering and procure and construct. And in our FIDIC contracts, there is an option for price adjustment for the effects of inflation, a schedule of cost indexation. So if it's decided to put this in, we can create a cost index schedule. And FIDIC is actually very good as they provide guidance documents with the contract itself, and they give an example of a cost indexation formula. So you can have a different inflationary index for, say, labour, a different one for equipment, a different one for materials, and we can make it as fine and granular as we would like. So there is an option in there to adjust the FIDIC contract pricing for the effects of inflation. So some of the contracts have inflation accommodating clauses, and I think the discussions are going on around should we include it and how would it work. Contractors want it to be in and clients are nervous, understandably.
So, Kieran, you've mentioned that contracts are a formal way of dealing with inflation issues, but are there other alternatives that are being considered?
Oh, yes. Okay. So, yeah, quite rightly, Philippa, the contracts have these optional mechanisms for dealing with price fluctuation, including inflation. Alternatives. So discussions in the wider industry about how might we manage it. So rather than just being reactive to it, can we kind of be a bit more preventative? Some discussions around taking the construction part a bit further downstream. So many of our projects are on a sort of design and build basis, so that the client and their team will develop the scheme and the scope, and then let the contractor to fulfill the design and procure and build and deliver the project. And there is some discussion about could we progress the design with the client a bit further downstream, more detail and more certain. What would that do? It would firstly perhaps shorten the whole construction program for the contractor, because now they're focused more on build rather than design and build. And also in terms of pricing, if we're more certain about the design and what's required, we can be more certain and accurate in the price and the impact. So there's a sort of evergreen discussion across the industry about modern methods of construction, offsite construction, factory build, modular build. And that's a thread that has been going for a long, long time. It's not without its challenges. Construction projects are quite different to many other elements, and many of the manufacturing industry approaches, whilst good, they need adaptation. And then probably also is to try and upfront discuss and agree how we might deal with the volatility through maybe the allocation of what we would call risk pots. So what's a risk pot? Agree the risks in the construction project, the main risks, and allocate some funds to each, which are only used then if the risk transpires. And you could have a risk pot for inflation. There is some discussion about it. Now, accessing the risk pot is the negotiated part. So we might say, here is a risk pot, a pot of money which we use for the effects of inflation, but it's only accessible if inflation rises above a certain value. The client then sets aside the funds, only used if inflation is particularly high and insidious through our projects, and the contractor bears a defined risk and then can access additional funds if the risk exceeds it. And what we're trying to do in our efforts is reduce the size of the error in our forecasting and try to reach a kind of agreeable way of doing it. So there are some mechanisms outside the formal contract parts, and they are being discussed.
So can you now give us some updates, really, Kieran, on what are you seeing in terms of, is there an increase in disputes in the construction industry and the typical cause of those disputes?
I suppose it depends on what you'd be expecting at this stage. That, to bring our podcast to a kind of a natural high at the close, we should be seeing this is feeding through to increases in disputes and higher values and great unhappiness, but it's not. I'm really happy to report that we're not seeing it feed through into disputes. I guess my caveat is not yet. Time and cost, two major contributions. Everything takes longer. Reduced skilled labour, so our construction is taking longer. Long lead time on material supplies and products, our projects are taking longer. And extending the project delivery time means that the client is seeing a kind of delay in their realization of their project, whether it's for habitation, commercial storage, material supply, whatever it might be. So delayed realization, so they are now funding their projects for longer. And for the contractor, the longer their on-site construction, the more it's costing them. So they're incurring more cost. And then a background to that, as we've talked today, is labour, plant, materials, etc., are going up in price. The client's finance is increasing costs. The contractor's cash flow coverage is increasing. So higher project costs and lower margins. So it seems natural fuel to disputes. What are we seeing? I think it's fair to say that UK construction has a fairly well-developed sort of dispute processes in a good way. We all have dispute escalation ladders, and they run through from what could be very simple negotiation, you and I sitting down and trying to agree, difference of opinion, but let's move on. It could be facilitated. We've also have alternative dispute resolutions in terms of things like mediation, which is an incredibly effective way to resolve disputes, not hugely taken up in the construction industry, recommended and endorsed and kind of pushed back by the high courts to say they always encourage the parties to at least consider alternative dispute resolution before coming before the bench. And then we have adjudication, which, like it or loathe it, as actually a primary contributory factor as to why UK construction project disputes are resolved more quickly than most other jurisdictions. So if you looked at resolving the time taken to resolve disputes in the UK market, the North America market, the Middle East or elsewhere, the UK lead the way in terms of short durations, not short, but shorter than the others, because we have an adjudication process as part of the law in the UK. The Adjudication Society are saying the number of dispute referrals continues to increase, but it's a gradual upward trend. There's no uptick occurred in the last sort of 12, 24 months. What are the causes? Poor contract administration. So quite simply, the parties involved not following the rules of the contract and what it says. That's generally leading to the sort of primary issue is extensions of time or valuation of the project. The adjudication process is seeing a sort of linear increase year on year and no significant uptick. So it's working quite well. The time is quite short. The value is not increasing. What they are seeing, and one of the global construction reports has said recently that there is a little hardening of the approach. So I think we're seeing more construction disputes based on poor contract admin, and also that they feel that some of the claims are now less well documented than they used to be. At the other end of the spectrum, into the high courts, again, they're seeing around about the same number of disputes being referred through the high courts as previously. No significant uptick. In the technology and construction division of the High Court, construction are the largest sort of sector by a long margin for High Court disputes. So good news, certainly in the short term, is that these sort of volatile impacts we're seeing in the industry aren't leading to an increase in disputes just yet. There is a feeling they might, but we haven't realised it. And I think the real answer there is to continue to talk and negotiate and collaborate together. You know, there are some challenging times that we're kind of facing, and it would be good to continue to face them collaboratively, I think, Philippa.
Fantastic. That's a great message to end on. So, Kieran, I want to really thank you for your time contributing to this episode and for sharing your perspective on such an important topic.
Thank you.
Thank you to everybody who listened, and thank you for joining the WTW Construction Blueprints podcast. We'll talk to you on the next one.
Thank you for joining this WTW podcast featuring the latest thinking and perspectives on people, capital, climate, and risk in the construction industry. For more information, visit WTWCO.com. Willis Towers Watson offers insurance-related services through its appropriately licensed and authorized companies in each country in which Willis Towers Watson operates. For further authorization and regulatory details about our Willis Towers Watson legal entities operating in your country, please refer to our Willis Towers Watson website at WTWCO.com. It is a regulatory requirement for us to consider our local licensing requirements. Some information contained in this podcast may be compiled or provided from third-party sources we consider to be reliable. However, we do not guarantee and are not responsible for the accuracy of such. The views expressed in this podcast are not necessarily those of Willis Towers Watson. Willis Towers Watson accepts no responsibility for the content or quality of any third-party contributor, guest, or publication to which we refer. This information contained herein is for general informational purposes only. It is not presented for purposes of reliance and does not constitute legal advice, tax advice, investment advice, insurance advice, or any other form of professional advice. This podcast is for general discussion and/or information only, is not intended to be relied upon, and action based on or in connection with anything contained herein should not be taken without first obtaining specific advice from a suitably qualified professional.